Welcome back to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. I'm your host, Tom Schwab, and today we're going to uncover what it truly means to stand out in a crowded marketplace of ideas. In a world where everyone is vying for attention, how do you make sure your message isn't just heard, but it's unignorable? To help us navigate this challenge, I'm thrilled to have Peter Levitan to the show. Peter's an old friend, a client. He's a seasoned marketing expert with decades of experience in advertising, media, and podcasting. He's worked with some of the biggest names in the industry and has a wealth of knowledge on how to cut through the noise and get heard. Today, Peter will share his insights on what it means to be unignorable, a concept that he's mastered over his career, and how you can apply these strategies in your own marketing efforts, especially through podcasting. Whether you're a business owner, marketer, or just someone looking to elevate your brand, this episode is packed with actionable advice that can help you not just survive, but thrive in today's competitive landscape. Let's dive in. Peter, you've got a very unique background and insight that you bring to marketing and especially podcasting here. So can you share a little bit about your background and how you see the world?
Well, I think, how do I see the world? I think that there's one critical issue. I kind of hammer that in some of the writings I've done and a couple of podcast interviews that I've done and so forth. And that is, you can do everything for your business and your product and your service that is right on and solves the problems, feeds the hungry, does whatever it's supposed to do for mankind. But if nobody knows that you're alive, it's irrelevant. Okay. So I call it being unignorable. And I always say to my clients, if what's the opposite of unignorable? And of course, it's ignorable. So my main message to many of my marketing clients is try to be unignorable. Work at that.
And that word has always resonated with me. And when I first read that in something that you had published, it was like, that's so true, that it's like, there's not yes and no. You know, the great thing is yes. Middle thing is no. The worst thing is just to be ignored. That's what's really painful. So how do you set yourself up so that you take the worst out and that you can get to a yes or no? And talk a little bit about your agency experience, because there's a lot of people that are talking about, how to market professional services. You've got a whole lot of experience behind that.
Well, there's I was going to say liturgy, but that's not the word. A litany, a list of whatever the heck the word is, a list of things that a marketing services agency needs to do. And I didn't make up this stuff. I'm just generally annoyed and somewhat flabbergasted that a lot of these advertising agencies don't do what I'm about to say. So number one is figure out what it is that you offer. Like, what is the offer? Are you a generalist, or are you an SEO specialist, or whatever? Okay. I would say 9 to 12 months ago, a couple of not that many savvy agencies figured out that if they really dug into AI, that they could be perceived as an industry leader. It's somewhat mind-blowing to me. I don't mean to be negative here, how few agencies actually jumped on that. I couldn't believe it, frankly. And it's still the case. I can tell you that the large companies, I'm trying to think of the large consulting companies, they're on it. They get it. Okay. And I saw the other day that 60% of one of the large, it doesn't matter who it was, of these large international consulting companies, 60% of their business growth is coming out of AI consulting. Okay. So one is, what is it that you offer the marketplace? The second is, who in this giant universe of potential clients are you trying to reach? Is it everybody? Is it doctors? Is it car mechanics? Is it people that eat breakfast cereal, pet foods? You don't have to get super narrow, but get a bit narrow. So when you call up somebody at Ralston Purina, they go, oh, yeah, I should talk to you. So at least look like an expert at something, whether it's a deliverable or a client category. And then figure out your finances. The only thing you can truly control are your costs, right? So that's another one. If you have existing clients, make sure that they love you and want to give you more business. There's generally more business to be had from an existing client. And I'm simplifying, obviously, hours of conversation here. And then the last one is, how do you go out and get yourself in front of the kinds of clients that you want to talk to? How do you figure them out? How do you figure out their needs? And then when you do that, how do you make yourself unignorable?
And you resonate with a lot of things that we've talked about before, right? It's not just more. It's how do you get better, right? When you were talking about earlier that, it's like being a cancer doctor. People have a pain and a need. They will find you if they don't look for the generalist on that.
Right. Well, I remember I had some surgery to my ankle once, right, when I was a runner. And I remember saying, well, two things. I remember saying to the doctor, the bone guy, I said, have you done this operation before? He says, I do 4 a week. But more interesting to me was his wall of photographs of his Porsches. So it took me 5 milliseconds to determine this guy was the expert ankle guy.
And if he's doing 4 a week, he's doing them well on there too. And that's why sometimes people come to us and say, can you do this? Yeah, I'm sure I could probably figure out how to do it, but you don't want that, right? It's like asking your dentist, can you fix my ankle? I love my dentist, but that's not their expertise.
Right. So be an expert and, be somewhat narrowly focused and stand out.
So you have tried podcasting as a means to stand out. And what I love about you, Peter, is that you not only run the tests, but then you write about them and said, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm learning. And, so many people just talk about the good, the wins, but you're telling about this worked, this didn't. And I think that's really interesting in the industry. So can you share a little bit about there and your experience? Because you were both a podcast host and a podcast guest.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about hosting for a second. We're talking about a relatively easy to do marketing platform. I mean, I have a microphone. I have a couple of digital tools that I use. I have a distribution system. All of that took me, and this is now probably 5-6 years ago when I started to do this. It took me half a day to figure everything out. Okay. What are the platforms? How do they work? What's best? There's so much information. You don't have to invent podcasts. You just go to YouTube and say, how do I do a podcast? So the nuts and bolts are relatively easy to do. And then I'll just switch out to how do you create something that people want to listen to? Gee, what a crazy idea. I mean, just because you're yapping into a microphone and you're talking to somebody, may or may not drive your business. We're going to be boring here for a second, but it's really ask yourself, how am I going to stand out? How can this be unignorable? Because while there are a zillion more blogs out there than podcasts, there are still a lot of podcasts. So how do you do that? And I'm not sure that I unlocked the secrets. And frankly, I could probably say I haven't, because I haven't recorded in about a couple of years. But I still get traffic to my podcasts. I mean, I'm looking at my numbers, and even interviews that are 2 years old are still getting traffic. So it works.
Now, were you intentional on that when you were talking about things to make them timely, but also timeless, so that you weren't talking about, something that would be interesting today, but not in the future? Because you talk about big principles that you've learned along the way.
Well, I think we all know that if you're writing, because we're kind of schooled in this. Let's just pick an old word here, blogging. If you're writing about a current event or a current issue, you should get more traffic to that because you're being very timely. There are probably words in journalism that work to describe this, but essentially you're somewhat involved in what the news is of the day. A podcast like that or a podcast episode like that will probably have a short lifespan because, in 6 months, we're not going to want to listen to people talk about Joe Biden and his whatever. I'm hoping we don't have, whatever. Okay. It's another story. So there's that. On the other hand, I have tried to go for evergreen, because I recognize that people will find your podcast 2 years later, and if your message and your conversation is not too narrow and not too news focused, yes, people will read it and get something out of it. I mean, I have a book that's 10 years old about pitching that still does very well in terms of sales. And I would say, other than the fact that Zoom changed how many pitches work, the core elements of the book and my advice, it still resonates. I mean, I get emails from people say, thanks so much for that book. Right? Nobody says to me, gee, you don't talk about Zoom, because, or Riverside, which is what we're using today, probably a better platform for podcasting. Anyway, that's, the bottom line is, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but you can go two ways. I've gone for trying to stay relevant.
Yeah. And I think that's an important observation, right? Because Wall Street Journal has a daily briefing twice a day, right? That gets lots of downloads. I don't think it's got a long tail to it. Nobody's going back and saying, oh, I want to listen to the news again. What was the news back on this day? It doesn't happen. So, and then the other thing too, is that most interview-based podcasts, there's time to it, right? So if you talk about something that's too newsworthy, by the time it gets edited and published and put out there, it can be irrelevant at that point too. So that's aside from the host. What was your experience being a guest on podcasts? Same platform, but really leveraging it from a different way.
Well, the flip side of this, and I know that I've written about it, is I've said to my clients and to the market in general, often don't create your own podcast, right? Be a guest. If you want to reach a wider audience, be a guest on podcasts. It's that simple. Plus, it's quote free. I mean, yeah, okay. Get a nice microphone and sound good. Pay attention to what the host is asking you to do. Maybe if you can have a pre-conversation. But the bottom line is you are borrowing their audience, right? They're spending the time theoretically, because you do have to choose what podcast you want to be on. They are theoretically marketing their podcast. So one of the things you do want to look for is it a podcast not only has a decent audience, but is it being marketed?
Yeah, it's that idea of leveraging other people's money. They'd say that in real estate. Well, why not leverage other people's audiences, right? You can throw the party or go to the party. One of them's easier and more fun. You can speak at an event or host an event. One of them is a whole lot easier there.
It's I'm going to say that it's free. And if you can get free, quote, advertising and awareness, unquote, go get it. And sure, you're beholden to the host's ability to ask you the right questions, but we're all smart enough, especially anybody in advertising, to direct the conversation to the stuff that you want it to be directed to.
I've always looked at it as earned, not paid. You say free, but similarly the same way there. And I think people know the difference. Is this legitimate or is this the paid advertisement on there?
Well, do you mean does the audience? I think. Well, I'm not sure if the audience. Well, all right, I'm going to talk about advertising and podcasting in a second. I think that you can figure out by listening to anybody that asks you to be on their show, listening to 3 or 4 of their episodes, and figure out how to turn them and their audience on, assuming their audience gets turned on. So, again, all of this to me is what's mind blowing about podcasting is how fast and relatively compared to everything else, how simple it is.
Do you think there's certain areas that it works better for on there? Because for me, we've always seen professional services where it's a relationship sale, more of a relationship than a transaction, right? I don't have to know, who made my Apple charger, the knockoff Apple charger. It's just a commodity. But if I'm going to work with somebody that I have to know, like, and trust, right? It's a relationship. It's a bigger investment. Do you think that works better there and bigger ideas?
Well, if you approach being a guest on a podcast as a marketing event for you personally or your company, then you really need to think about what is it that you want to say to people that is going to get them to pay attention. And to, if if you want to lead, then you're going to have to somehow bake it in relatively subtly into what you're about to talk about. A good podcast host, which you can determine pretty quickly, do they do a good job on their notes? Do they promote it? Do they have it on their website and also on multiple platforms? So there's a few things to think about, but it's ultimately marketing. I mean, you have to decide before you're just yapping, what is it that I want the audience to take away? And as we all know, unfortunately, sometimes you have to repeat yourself 3 times before anybody actually hears what you just said. So I'm saying it again. Be unignorable.
Well, and you made a point there that said, if you're doing it for marketing, I just look at it and say, I've done a lot of podcasts. Some of it's for friends, just need to talk with them on their show to help them out. But life is busy. If I'm going to be on a show, I want to get some kind of result out of it, right? Some people do it for ego, but that doesn't last long, right? It shouldn't just be podcast guesting. It should be podcast interview marketing in my viewpoint on that.
I mean, are you getting, does the host ask you to promote the podcast? Are they giving you graphical elements that you can post on a LinkedIn or whatever, right? All of that is a plus. But again, I think it's incumbent upon you as a guest, and you can't be on every podcast. You do have to choose what you want to be on. And conversely, actually, as you know better than I do, not only choose what you want to be on, but actually go after the ones that you want to be on, because that's a whole other story. How do you entice somebody to pay attention to you? So it's a matrix, but again, compared to a lot of other things I'm seeing out there, like running an Instagram account, this is pretty easy stuff.
So what were mistakes that you made along the way, right? I always say it's best not to learn from your mistakes. That's painful. I always want to learn from other people's mistakes. And I've written books on my mistakes. So was there any that come to your mind?
Well, the something I learned about halfway through, and this is when as a guest, and I mentioned this earlier, trying to determine what can I do to control the interview. Okay, right? I mean, we know that all you have to do is watch CNN, God forbid, for 2 hours, and the savvy interviewees know how to manage their story, their points that they want to make. I think that a mistake that I started to see happening, because it was boring the hell out of me, was I'd get on a podcast and they say, so Peter, tell us about your career. You worked in New York and you worked in London and you ran an office in Minneapolis and you did this and you did that. And I started to say, okay, look, I didn't probably say it using these words, but in my brain, I'm like, okay, you can read my bio on my website. You can read my bio on LinkedIn. It's nuts and bolts. I worked at Saatchi. I did, like everybody else, I've had jobs. Okay. Some were sexy and sounded sexy. Saatchi, working for Morris & Charles directly in London. Okay, cool. But what I started to do was talk about me. And I said, I'm not sure if this completely resonated, but I said, all right, do you want to understand who I am? My high school was across the street from Lincoln Center. I lived down the street from Carnegie Hall. Tiffany's was down a block away. I went to the Museum of Modern Art all the time. I grew up in museums in New York. That's all you need to know. I'm a New Yorker, and this is my background. Because we don't get very personal. Again, we say, oh, I started an agency in Egypt, and then I moved it to New York, and General Mills was my client. I'm like,
I was going to say that is a great hook, though, that you gave, and we talked with Jeff Bartz specifically on how do you answer that first question when they give you something like a big softball like that. So tell me about yourself, right? Nobody wants to know, your resume, what they could read on LinkedIn. They want to know what your sports are, what your hobbies are, what your pets' names are. But you gave them something there that was interesting and that can roll into other things. So it's like, why is this person different? And it gives some color to that. And yeah, I would say I hear a lot of people doing that. That first question of, tell us about yourself, and that last question of, so Peter, how do people find out about you?
Right, right. Well, yes, and so I think my point here is that as a guest, as a polite guest, right, I think you can kind of move the conversation into the spaces that you want to move it into. And part of that is really understanding the psychology of the host and the goal of the host show. Some of these folks haven't had a lot of time to actually. Some haven't spent the time to figure out what are the 10 most important questions I'm supposed to ask Peter, that kind of deal. So if you're not seeing it, you need to somehow take charge of the interview.
Do you find it's easier, because you've done a lot of television and radio, traditional PR? Do you find it easier with podcasts with a longer form and maybe hosts that give you more leeway in the interview?
Well, the people that sort of allow the person being interviewed to come across as a human being is generally a good thing. And I think everybody has their favorite top podcasts and who's a good interviewer. There's one that I've been listening to lately. I think it's called The Diary of a CEO. And I think it gets, a bazillion downloads a minute. It's one of but the key there is the guy's a very good host. And I've listened to him just at an audio podcast, and I've also seen his YouTube channel. He's empathetic. He studied the background of the person that he's interviewing. He understands what it is that he wants out of the interview, I think. It's people like that, the really good interviewers, and some are from the press, obviously. I think it's important before you do any of this, see who's doing well as a guest and a host, and figure out how you can manage your experience, because you're the person managing your brand.
Yeah, I've heard some people say, when we talk with them, it's like they'll say, well, I don't listen to podcasts. It seems like you should.
Who's that?
It's, seriously, it's usually someone where it's the chief marketing officer says, we have to do this, right? This is a great medium that we've got to get into. And then the talent, whoever that is, the CEO, whatever, says, well, I don't listen to podcasts, but I can do those. And it's like, you better understand the medium a little bit, at least listen to the shows that you're going to be on, because it is different than a keynote speech. It's different than going on, 60 minutes. I always say it's not an interview. It's more of a discussion.
Well, frankly, it's a parallel as if you're being asked to speak at a conference. Again, what does the audience need to hear? What do they want to hear? What's going to turn them on? And then is there anything that you can do to really grab their attention and hold it? Because I think we've all sat in audiences where you're losing your mind. You want to, do anything but sit in that room. So all of, I just say it's a little bit theater, right? And I'm not doing anything in this particular conversation that I might suggest to some of my agency clients in terms of, how do you even start an interview where people are going to go, holy shit, what is this guy about? It's like everything's sort of bland and organized. What if you try to be unignored?
I've heard it referred to as a performance before, right? You got to get up there and, bring your A game, right? No matter what it is. I've never heard it referred to as theater. Unpack that a little bit. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's, I don't want to get too ridiculous here, but theater of the mind. I think we all know, here, I'll just keep it a simple one. Before you're being interviewed, or if you're a host, what are stories that you can tell? Because we know ad nauseum, we've all read all the research and whatever, we all know about this. Back to the cavemen, they told stories. Okay, we've heard that. Well, how can you turn one of the gems that you want to deliver to the audience into a story? I have a story which I probably talked about many times in interviews, but I also use it as a way to force people to go to my website. And that is, I talk about the worst advertising pitch ever. Okay, which I'll just leave it at this to keep it simple right now. We didn't win the global Adidas pitch If we had won it, I would have run the global Adidas account out of London, out of my own brand new sports agency. I knew the CEO of Adidas, okay, who had said to me before we did anything, Levitan, unless you fuck up, you have this account. Well, I'll just leave you with enough information to, generate a little saliva here. And that is, we didn't win it once we showed the client the movie of the baby seals being beaten. Okay. Now, why did I say that? Because it's a story. It's, agencies love hearing those kinds of stories. It was a very good story. It included the bigwigs of Saatchi. We were pitching a CEO that we knew. I would have completely changed my career. But I only said enough that hopefully somebody listening will go, I'll go to peterlevitan.com and listen to the worst advertising pitch ever. Okay. A hook. I mean, I just blew that one out of my brain right now. But, if you spend half an hour thinking through the theater, I think you'll do a better job in an interview.
And I would point out that 70% of interviews are listened to sped up. So I don't know. I jokingly say I listen at 2x as I run at half x. If I was running any slower, it'd be sightseeing. But even in that story, you left room for those pauses for people to think about that. And often I find a mistake that people make is they get so excited that they talk faster, faster, and faster. And it's not that they're talking too fast. It's that there's not enough pauses for people to think and come up to speed on it, right? It's like you've got to pause before the punchline to let everybody catch up.
Well, watch. Although I'll talk about catching up in a second related to Robin Williams, but I think it's it's good as just sort of general mind work to listen to and watch some stand-up comedians and how they deliver a punchline and how much space they put between a story and a punchline. On the other hand, I once saw Robin Williams eons ago, and he was talking so fast that he stops and he looks at the audience and he goes, "Catch up with me." Okay. Now, few of us are geniuses, comedic geniuses, but he went so fast, he had to actually tell the audience to catch up. That was a highly memorable moment for me. Again, so it was hard to ignore this crazy guy telling me to speed up my brain.
But he acknowledged it as opposed to just going on and on with it.
No, he got it. Yeah, no, and of course that was part of his shtick, was his brain worked faster than any other human, right? But I think there's a lot of learning to understand pacing from stand-up guys.
That's interesting. That could do a whole series on how theater and comedy make you a better podcast guest.
I mean, I think you have to, one has to decide what is it that you want out of the podcasting universe, whether it's your podcast or someone else's, and then how do you get to that? How do you meet that objective? Again, I listen to these podcasts one a week, sometimes one a day, and I'm like, okay, is there a matrix here? Does it change? Does it morph? Does it get different? And for many podcasts, it's the same old. And I'll say that I did this as well. Kind of the same old, right? The one I did on week 1 kind of sounds like the one I did on week 8. So how do you mash it up? I think we see some creative podcasts where they start out with a story before they even say what the podcast is. I think there are different ways to do this. And there are good creative directors who should be working with this rather than just have it be the biz dev people and the CEO.
On the guest side, how did you intentionally become unignorable by keeping it fresh and not every interview sounding like Groundhog's Day? I
have to tell you that, so I've been interviewed for a couple of things. One is my general background as a consultant in the advertising industry space. So that's one. I've also been interviewed a bunch of times. Going back, 20 years, about a company that I had I was a founder and CEO of, called Active Buddy, which had a bot called Smarter Child. And over the years, people, depending on their age group, I get a lot of people in their 30s who are running some form of press at this point, saying to me, "Oh, I want to talk to you about this thing that you did years ago. Smarter Child was the first intelligent bot that you could talk to." Okay. And we were a great example of a dot-com boom and bust company, right? But I was just interviewed, I don't know, a month ago. I can't remember I don't know. I'm blanking. The biggest, most listened to read tech podcast. Okay, all they wanted to talk about, and it was a video podcast. It was very well produced. Was what did I do 30 years ago? So and anyway, that started to bore me because they're asking me the same questions as New York Times, et cetera. Unless this is a subject I like, so talking to you is fun for me. But when it's just regurgitating all this stuff, it can get. I got bored. I didn't want to do it anymore.
My guess is that talking about stories from 30 years ago isn't going to help you in the future, right? It's just rehashing history there. If they wanted to learn about it, there's probably, you could ask ChatGPT or Google to get those answers.
Look, all these, again, understand the motivations of the podcast and the podcast host. They're theoretically selling newspapers, use an analogy. Why are they doing this? And what can as you have to mate the goal of the host with the goal of the person being interviewed. And sometimes someone else has to take charge. Rarely do I really hear a lot of guests sort of taking charge of the interview. And the ones that are good at it, and you see it, the perpetual talk at you people that you see on a CNN, they get pretty good at that.
We had a client that was on one of the big news shows. I won't say which network, but he's on there 3 or 4 times a week. And he's like, you got 3 minutes. And if they don't take a minute of it, you might get 2, but you're always battling for that. And you got to be so tight. And he actually liked the podcast interviews because he could, Morgan could talk during those, although we did have to help him with some coaching. It's like, dude, you got to give longer answers. This is a 45-minute podcast. You're killing them with your sound bites.
Right. Well, I mean, again, that's just something, if you're going to be interviewed by somebody, understand, how much time they're giving you. And often it's too much time. I mean, there's nothing I can talk about. I mean, I've written books that will take you a lot longer than 45 minutes to read them. But, buy my book. Don't have me talk for 45 minutes.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time here. And what's ordinary to you is amazing to others, right? Thank you for sharing that. If you were talking to somebody that's an agency owner right now, what would you want them to know? The one piece of insight, the wisdom that you would have about using podcasts as a marketing channel?
I would approach it as a media buy, quote, buy, unquote. I would certainly start with a very clear objective and understanding why am I doing this in the first place and what do I want out of it? Almost write yourself a creative brief for this is my approach to me being interviewed. I think that I have actually written podcast creative briefs. I think they're up on my website, hidden under, if you search on podcasts, you can see it. But, write a podcast creative brief. Who am I talking to? What am I selling? Or what's the takeaway? What's going to motivate them? And what are the 5 points I have to make to get the message across? And just know that, right? And again, back to what I said earlier, if you're interviewed a bunch of times, figure out ways to make each of those interviews a little bit different.
For the audience, for the host, and for your own sanity.
And your mom.
Well, Peter, I know I I'm on your newsletter list there. I always look forward to it. Great stuff. And your website, the other thing I like about it, it's very searchable, where I'm like, what does Peter say about this? I can go back to your website, search for a keyword, and it's like seeing all of the things that you've written over the years on that. Where can people get in touch with you or find out more?
I think the simplest thing is just look for me on LinkedIn, Peter Levitan, Levitan, or go to my website, peterlevitan.com. I mean, that's, it works. It is always interesting to see, the activity that you get when you are interviewed. I mean, that's the fun is somebody says, oh, I just heard you and let's talk, right? Okay.
Oh, that's the magic that happens. And I've often said, we're not one funnel away, we're one conversation away.
Oofta. Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, man, take it easy.
What an enlightening conversation with Peter Levitan. Today, we explored the importance of being unignorable in a world where it's all too easy to get lost in the shuffle. Peter's insights on how to craft a message that truly resonates, how to choose the right platforms, and how to leverage podcasting as a powerful marketing tools, they're just invaluable. If there's one big takeaway from me on today's episodes, it's this. Don't settle for just being another voice in the crowd. Be intentional about your message, your audience, and your delivery. Whether it's through podcasting or any other medium, the goal should be to leave a lasting impression, an impression that people can't ignore. Now, your next step. Take a hard look at your current marketing strategy. Are you making yourself unignorable? If not, it's time to start. Apply the principles Peter shared today to your own business and watch how you can transform the way you connect with your ideal clients. If you found today's episode valuable, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who could benefit from these insights. As always, keep leveraging the power of podcast interviews to grow your brand and to make your mark. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries and make yourself unignorable.